This week on Scripturology.
But even if you're just young in the faith, you need to know God is not obligated to reward you for your service in this life. My husband Gary will be the first to acknowledge that he is not a handyman. In fact, we joke that if Gary comes at anything with a hammer or a screwdriver, that thing will be worse off than it was before he touched it. If something's broken at our house, either I fix it or I call a professional in. I think Moses could relate to my husband. In today's Scripturology lesson, we're going to see Moses take a situation from bad to worse. Last week in our lesson, God appeared to Moses and spoke to him out of a burning bush. Just like you or I surely would, Moses had a few questions. He asked God, "Who am I?" And then he asked God, "Who are you?" The Lord patiently answered Moses' questions and even gave him amazing assurances of success. But Moses isn't finished with his questions for God. Let's pick up the conversation at the burning bush. We're going to be reading Exodus chapter 4, verses 1 through 17. Then Moses answered, "But behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.' The Lord said to him, 'What is in your hand?' He said, 'A staff.' And he said, 'Throw it on the ground.' So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, 'Put out your hand and catch it by the tail.' So he put out his hand and caught it by the tail, and it became a staff in his hand, that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you." Again the Lord said to him, "Put your hand inside your cloak." And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, "Put your hand back inside your cloak." So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of its flesh. "If they will not believe you," God said, "or listen to the first sign, that they may believe the latter sign. If they will not believe even these two signs to listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. And the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground." But Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and tongue." Then the Lord said to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." But he said, "O my Lord, please send someone else." Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is there not Aaron your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, that I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be God to him. And take in your hand this staff with which you shall do the signs." Now, when God has given you an assignment and assurance of its success, it's not a good idea to respond with the word "but." 3 times in verses 1, 10, and 13, Moses raises an objection to God's plan. The first time, Moses is worried his fellow Hebrews won't believe God really appeared to him. So even though God had already given Moses verbal assurance of success and the sign that he would be serving God back there at Mount Horeb once he'd led the Hebrews out of Egypt, then God gave Moses 3 signs for the people back in Egypt. Now, I love how God gives him the first sign with the closest, most ordinary thing around, the staff that happens to be in his own hand. It was just an old dead stick that Moses had likely used every day for years. But when God turned it into a live snake, Moses ran in fear of that old dead stick. God doesn't need much to work with to display his power. He can use the most ordinary things, and he can use the most ordinary people. Now, it's interesting that Moses doesn't argue with God about picking up that snake by the tail. Okay, any wilderness shepherd knew if you pick up a snake by the tail, you leave yourself vulnerable to being bit by it. If you're going to handle a snake, you pick it up behind the head so it can't reach around and bite you. But Moses does what he's instructed, and he has his shepherd's staff restored. Now, the second sign is even more frightening. Moses pulls his hand out of his cloak, and it is eaten up with leprosy. Okay, I would have fainted right then and there. Now, mercifully, God immediately tells Moses to put his hand back in his cloak, and it's restored. But this sign would have proven to anyone who saw it that God has power over people, just like the first sign demonstrated God's power over living creatures. And then the third sign of Nile water being turned to blood. The third sign would demonstrate God's power over the elements of nature. In the days to come, Pharaoh of Egypt was going to get a supersized demonstration of God's sovereignty in each of these 3 areas. It's hard to believe after the signs Moses just witnessed, but he still has concerns about his assignment. Apparently, he has flunked his lessons in elocution that he was given in Pharaoh's household. Moses says he can't talk right. Not only that, but did you hear the sassiness in what he said to God about it? Let's look at it on the screen. But Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and tongue." Okay, Moses acknowledges that he hasn't been a smooth talker either in the past or in the 10 minutes since God first initiated this conversation with him. The implication was, if God really wanted Moses to talk to Pharaoh, he should have already fixed Moses' problem, which still wasn't any better. Now, I think the Lord would have been within his rights if he would have sent out a small little flare from that burning bush to give Moses a little singe. Imagine Moses going home to his family without eyebrows. But God is long-suffering. His response is probably more stunning to readers today than it was to Moses. God asks the rhetorical question, who made man's mouth? Who makes man mute, deaf, seeing, or blind? And then God answers with another rhetorical question. Isn't it me? Now, Moses accepted that word from God, but many Christians don't. I'm sure most of you have heard other Christians, even Christian leaders, explain that birth defects and syndromes occur by saying, well, we just live in a cursed and fallen world. I guess that's supposed to mean that these things just happen by chance. I think they're trying to help God out and to spare his reputation by insinuating that he just has no control over things like birth defects. The first problem with that is that God himself would beg to differ with that conclusion. Here in our text, he takes complete responsibility for birth defects. He couldn't be more clear. The second problem with denying God's responsibility is that we don't do him any favors when we limit his authority, no matter how good our intentions are. I mean, really, is it more comforting to think that God is sovereign and intentional in even the most difficult physical trials that we or our children face, and that He has purpose for it? Or is it more comforting to think that God just couldn't do anything about it? He would if He could, but He can't because, this cursed world is beyond His reach. That's neither comforting nor theologically accurate. Make a note of this verse, Exodus 4:11, and let it impact your idea of who God is. Well, it's Moses' third objection that reaches the limit of God's patience with Moses. Moses has been given signs and promises of God's help, and with no more objections to raise, Moses finally flat out says, just send someone else. Now, that the fact that the Lord is slow to anger implies that He does eventually get angry. And God was angry at Moses' stubborn unbelief and his unwillingness to just obey. God had answered every concern that Moses had. And when Moses ran out of legitimate concerns, Moses showed his rebellious heart. Now, on the surface, it looks like God gives in to Moses' fears. He offers to let Aaron join the team and be Moses' spokesman before Pharaoh. But later on, Moses is going to regret having Aaron's help. Once the Hebrews leave Egypt, Aaron is going to be a burr in Moses' saddle on more than one occasion. Isn't that often the case? The one person that we think is absolutely essential to our church or our ministry becomes the person who causes the most heartache. When the conversation between God and Moses comes to an end, Moses' first move is to go back to his father-in-law. Well, he had to bring back his father-in-law's sheep, and he wanted to ask permission to see his people in Egypt. Permission is granted. So Moses packs up his wife, his sons, and his shepherd's staff, and he heads back to Egypt. Well, God meets Moses again and instructs him to do the miracles that He had showed him back at Mount Horeb. But God also warns Moses that he will encounter resistance because God will harden Pharaoh's heart. Now, while God was instructing Moses to go to Egypt, God was also instructing his brother Aaron to meet Moses in the wilderness. The two reunite, and Moses shares with his brother all that God had told him. The brothers go together to the elders of the Hebrews, and they speak God's message and perform the signs. Verse 31 says, "And the people believed, and when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads to worship." Back in chapter 3, God had told Moses the elders would listen to him, and they did. And it's good to see that their response also included worship. They believed that God would be their helper, and they responded with adoration. Now, if you read chapter 4 in preparation for our lesson before our time together, you might notice that I left something out of the narrative, something shocking. Verse 24 of chapter 4 says that when Moses was on his way to Egypt, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. No explanation is given, but the next thing we know, Moses' wife Zipporah takes a flint and circumcises her son. Now, most commentators assume this is Moses' firstborn son, Gershom, though it could have been that Moses never got around to circumcising his second son, Eleazar. It seems like Moses was already incapacitated at some level because Zipporah takes her son's foreskin and touches it to Moses' feet. Then she shouts at him, "You are a bridegroom of blood to me." Okay, after this domestic drama plays out, the text says, "So he let him alone." That's speaking of God, let Moses alone. I don't know about you, but when I read this incident, I felt that awkward feeling you get when another couple has a loud fight at a family get-together. You didn't really want to witness it, but since you have, you're not exactly sure whose side to take. Add to that the shocking catalyst of the whole crisis. It was God's intent to kill Moses. Oh, we didn't see that coming. Moses wasn't arguing with God anymore. He was on his way back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh, just as God had instructed him. So why would God want to kill Moses? Because God was serious about the covenant that he had made with Abraham. Let's take a look at something he told Abraham back in Genesis. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Circumcision wasn't a suggestion. It was a requirement as the distinguishing sign of God's people and the sign of their covenant with him. How was Moses supposed to lead God's people when he neglected to be the spiritual leader in his own little family? Circumcision was supposed to be done when a baby boy was 8 days old. If that child is not circumcised, the responsibility for breaking the covenant lies with the parents, the father. He is the covenant breaker. Now, many of us might be relieved that we don't face such stiff penalties because we're not under the old covenant. But I hope you know that there is a sign of the new covenant for God's people today that God certainly also takes very seriously. I hope that you'll take a look at that in the discussion guide questions for this lesson on our website, scripturology.com. We'll be right back after this brief break. I'm so glad you're watching today's program as we study the book of Exodus. Maybe this is the first time you've seen a scripturology program, or maybe you've been studying with us for a while. I want you to know that I have been and continue to be sitting in the student's chair myself. If there's one thing that can irritate me about a Bible study, it's when I feel like my time has been wasted. I consider it wasted if I don't learn something I didn't know before I invested my time with that teacher. That's the mindset I bring to teaching women on scripturology. Do not want to waste your time, and I hope that's evident in our lessons. If you're learning more about God and His Word and how to apply it, I'd ask you to tell a friend about our program. In this way, you can help us in our mission to make faithful disciples of Christ. We're going to continue our lesson by reading Exodus chapter 5, verses 1 through 14. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went out and said to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." But Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword." But the king of Egypt said to them, "Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people away from their work? Get back to your burdens." And Pharaoh said, "Behold, the people of the land are now many, and you make them rest from their burdens?" The same day Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people and their foremen, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks. Go in as in the past. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. But the number of bricks that they made in the past you shall impose on them, and you shall by no means reduce it, for they are idle. Therefore they cry, 'Let us go and offer sacrifice to our God.' Let the heavier work be laid on the men, that they may labor at it and pay no regard to their lying words." So the taskmasters and the foremen of the people went out and said to the people, "Thus says Pharaoh, I will not give you straw. Go and get straw yourselves wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced in the least." So the people were scattered throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble for straw. The taskmasters were urgent, saying, "Complete your work, your daily task each day, as when there was straw." And the foremen of the people of Israel, whom Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten. And they asked, "Why have you not done all your task of making bricks today and yesterday as in the past?" Well, talk about jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. the plan to lead God's people out of Egypt is not getting off to a great start. Pharaoh is not impressed by receiving a message from God. He asks, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" Now, if you look at the text in your Bible, you'll see that the word Lord is completely capitalized. That means Pharaoh is repeating the covenant name of God. Now, it's true that Moses also asked God who he was, but the attitudes of Moses and Pharaoh are completely different. Moses was reverentially fearful. Remember, he was having a personal encounter with a voice coming from a burning bush when he asked God who he was. And Moses was trying to hide his face in fear. Pharaoh gets a messenger sent from God, and his attitude is, "Who does this God think he is if I don't know him? Forget about it." Now, when Aaron asked for permission for the Hebrews to worship their God in the wilderness, he added, "Lest he fall upon us with pestilence or the sword." Now, it's not completely clear who the us is that Aaron's referring to. He could have meant the Hebrew people, indicating to Pharaoh the seriousness of their belief that worshiping their God was not optional. Then again, Aaron could have used the word us in the same sense that I use the word we when I say something to my husband Gary like, "We need to get the garbage put out to the street." Gary knows that my we means him. The us that should worry about pestilence and death by the sword in our text is not the Hebrews, but the Egyptians. Now, it's telling that Pharaoh doesn't have any questions about this God of the Hebrews that he's learning about and that he had been unfamiliar with. He just has absolutely zero interest in learning anything about him. Pharaoh doesn't even seem to entertain the idea that this God could actually be a real force to be reckoned with. That's not unlike the response of hard-hearted unbelievers today, is it? They don't want to know about him. Now, I couldn't help but think about my older brother Jerry in this context. Jerry was a drug and alcohol abuser, and he got throat cancer when he was in his late 40s. I went to visit him in Texas where he lived to make sure that he heard the gospel because it was clear Jerry was not going to recover from his cancer. When I got done telling him about Christ and how to be reconciled to God, his response was, "I'm tired. I need to go take a nap now." He had neither questions nor interest. He did not want to know about God. He died a few months later, and as far as I know, he died separated from God and will remain that way for eternity. I know that story is a real downer, and I want to hope that there was some last-minute conversion I didn't know about. And while that's possible, the reality is it's not probable. Jesus said that few find the narrow way, not most. We kid ourselves if we assume that everyone has a deathbed conversion. We need to let ourselves feel the horror of losing loved ones into a Christless eternity. Sin is real. Death is real. Hell is real. We may lie to ourselves, but this book doesn't lie. Getting back to our text, Pharaoh's conclusion about the request he received from Moses and Aaron was that the Hebrew people just had too much time on their hands if they were dreaming up wilderness worship retreats. His solution to their excess leisure time was to increase their responsibilities. They had to produce the same amount of bricks and get their own straw, which had previously been provided for them. So the command makes its way down the chain of command from Pharaoh's lips to the Egyptian taskmasters to the Hebrew foremen. Not surprisingly, the Hebrews can't gather straw and make the same quota of bricks as before. And the Egyptian taskmasters beat the Hebrew foremen. What do? The Hebrew foremen are able to go around their superiors and get an audience with Pharaoh himself, which to me seems like amazing access, considering they're slaves and he's king. But getting access is not the same thing as getting satisfaction. Pharaoh doesn't give them an inch of relief. Nothing is going to change. When the Hebrew foremen are leaving their unsuccessful meeting with Pharaoh, they meet Moses and Aaron, who've been waiting for them. Can't you imagine that Moses and Aaron expected something good would certainly come out of this meeting? This would be a good time for God to come through for his people. But this is what the foreman had to say to Moses and Aaron. The Lord look on you and judge, because you have made a stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. If Moses and Aaron were expecting a miracle, they did not get it. They got instead an earful of contempt from their fellow Hebrews. These were the people that in the last chapter believed when they heard the message that Moses and Aaron brought from God and saw the signs that they did. They were happy when things were going well. But when times got tough, they called down the curse of God's judgment on Moses and Aaron. If you're familiar with the story of Exodus, you know that this is only going to be a taste of what Moses can expect from the Hebrew people. And that often seems to be the case when it comes to serving God. If you're in it for quick results and accolades, there's a couple of things that you should prepare for. First, prepare to be disappointed. People are not going to feel obligated to pat you on the back, especially if they have an ounce of discernment about your selfish motives. But even if you're just young in the faith, you need to know God is not obligated to reward you for your service in this life. Our attitude must be that we are only unprofitable servants doing what's expected of us. Secondly, if we're only serving God with the expectation of quick results and accolades, then we should prepare to be humiliated. If we belong to Christ and we're seeking accolades for ourselves, the Father isn't going to have that. We were created for his glory, not the other way around, which would make us self-idolaters. According to Hebrews 12, the only way we'll escape discipline is if we're illegitimate children. And if that's the case, then we have bigger problems than not getting enough pats on the back. So as you serve God in your church, whether you're teaching or on the praise team or in administration or wherever you serve in your church, evaluate your motives and ask God to show you any glory seeking. We all need to confess the vanity and selfishness of our hearts and actively seek God's help to root it out and to purify our motives. We want to be storing treasures in heaven and not watching them burn.